There is a moment in the history of every nation when everything can be lost in a single decision. On the morning of the 10th of March, 2026, at exactly 40 minutes past 6, the sun had not yet fully risen over the capital. The air carried that quiet, heavy stillness that comes just before a nation begins to wake and work its soil. But within minutes, that profound stillness was permanently shattered. A message arrived at the highest level of government. It was not a normal daily intelligence report. It was not a standard political update. It was marked with a level of absolute urgency that does not appear within the system unless something has already gone fundamentally wrong or is about to. When Ibrahim Traoré received that document, he did not rush to react. History teaches us that when a threat is absolute, rushing only serves to cloud the mind and feed the panic. As the message was decoded line by line, a chilling reality settled into the room. This was not a diplomatic warning. It was a declaration of intent. The source of the transmission had been confirmed with near certainty, originating from an alliance of foreign powers whose exact identities and backroom dealings remained deliberately hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, this is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers, it keeps the story alive. The patterns of the communication match those of an international system that does not negotiate lightly and certainly does not threaten without the immediate, brutal capacity to strike. But what the message actually contained was something no leader ever expects to see printed in plain text. It was not a dispute over territorial boundaries. It was not a demand for cheaper access to vast mineral resources. It was not even about political power in the way that traditional empires usually understand it. It was about the very soul of the state. The ultimatum made it explicitly clear that the leadership of Burkina Faso was not being asked to merely adjust an economic policy or quietly change a geopolitical stance. They were being forced into a corner that no independent nation should ever have to face. The command was absolute. Within exactly 48 hours, the leadership was ordered to stand before the public and officially renounce the country's new path of absolute sovereignty. They were not asked to do this privately in a closed-door meeting with foreign ambassadors, nor quietly in a written statement where the damage could be contained. They were ordered to broadcast this surrender openly across the continent, to be seen and heard by more than 1 billion people. They were commanded to tell their own citizens that true independence was a dangerous illusion, and that the nation must return to the suffocating embrace of foreign dependency. And if this demand was refused, the consequences were not presented as a mere possibility. They were presented as an absolute, unavoidable certainty. A coup would be initiated. The message detailed that there were already factions inside the domestic security architecture ready to act upon receiving the signal. Men who wore the same uniform, who had sworn the same oath to protect the land, but who had chosen the dark path of betrayal for personal gain. Furthermore, heavily armed forces outside the borders were fully positioned and waiting to move. Everything had been meticulously arranged. It was not an idle threat. It was a death sentence for the nation's newfound freedom, quietly waiting to be executed. The weight of that morning did not rest simply on the fear of losing political office or facing physical danger. Power can be lost and regained, and danger is an accepted shadow of leadership. The true, crushing burden lay in what this ultimatum meant for the millions of ordinary citizens whose calloused hands work the earth every single day. These are the men and women who wake up long before the dawn to tend the harvest, who have bled and sacrificed, believing that the soil beneath their feet finally belongs to them. They had just begun to see a glimmer of light on the long, difficult road ahead. To stand before the world and bow to this overwhelming foreign pressure would not just be a political surrender. It would be a devastating betrayal of every seed of hope planted in that red earth. The foreign architects of this threat understood something that is frequently overlooked in global politics. They knew that you do not need to physically conquer a people if you can mentally break what they believe in. If you can force a sovereign leader to publicly abandon their core principles under the threat of violence, you do not just weaken a government. You send a chilling, irreversible message to millions of citizens that their independence is fragile, that their dignity can be bought or threatened, and that their future can always be silenced by a foreign pen. They wanted to turn the idea of sovereignty into a liability. They wanted to create an environment where standing firm becomes the harder path, not because it is wrong, but because the punishment is simply too severe. Faced with a ticking clock, the silence in the capital was deafening. Time, in moments of absolute crisis, does not feel like a gift. It feels like a merciless countdown. Every single minute carried the heavy weight of a nation's destiny. The ultimatum was brilliantly cruel: surrender the soul of the country or watch its physical structures be torn apart from the inside out. It was a choice between preserving a fragile, illusionary peace by kneeling or protecting the unseen dignity of the nation by risking total visible destruction. As the first hours of the 48-hour deadline began to slip away into history, a profound question hung in the heavy air. When a leader is deliberately forced to choose between the immediate safety of compliance and the perilous, lonely road of true sovereignty, what happens when the clock finally runs out? The silence that follows a devastating ultimatum is not empty, it is suffocating. As the first hours of the 48-hour countdown began to drain away, the true psychological weight of the situation settled over the capital. When a foreign power wants to break a nation in the 21st century, it rarely sends an invading army to cross the borders in broad daylight. The modern empire is far more calculated. It understands that the most efficient way to conquer a people is to turn them against themselves. It uses the structural fragility of a developing state as a weapon, maneuvering in the shadows to engineer a collapse from within. The most painful realization of that morning was not the arrogance of the foreign demands, but the tragic reality of internal betrayal. The intelligence confirmed that the planned coup was not merely a theoretical exercise drawn up in a distant embassy. It was actively supported by factions within the domestic security apparatus. The specific names and ranks of these internal conspirators who had secretly pledged their loyalty to a foreign agenda were confirmed, and their presence was undeniably real. These were men who wore the same uniform, who spoke the same language, and who were raised on the very same soil as the people they were preparing to subjugate. They had shared the harvest of their homeland, yet they were entirely willing to burn the fields to the ground in exchange for temporary power and the false promises of foreign handlers. This is the ultimate cruelty of neocolonialism. It turns brothers into instruments of foreign will. It forces a leader to look at his own ranks and wonder who has already traded the future of the nation for a comfortable position in the empire's shadow. For Ibrahim Traoré, the burden of this knowledge was profound. The threat was designed to make him feel entirely isolated, surrounded by invisible enemies, and cut off from the very people he was trying to protect. The empire gambles that a leader, when faced with the terrifying prospect of betrayal by his own inner circle, will inevitably choose personal survival over national dignity. They expect the leader to fold, to accept the terms of surrender, and to quietly manage the continued extraction of the nation's wealth. But leadership is not defined by the absence of fear. It is defined by the refusal to let fear dictate the future. Later that morning, a highly confidential meeting was convened with the closest military and political advisors. The atmosphere in the room was dense with unspoken tension. No one spoke carelessly because everyone understood that a single miscalculation would plunge the country into catastrophic violence. The intelligence was reviewed again. The confirmed risks, the timing of the sleeper cells, the heavily armed foreign units waiting patiently just beyond the borders, everything pointed to an unavoidable confrontation. If the leadership refused the ultimatum, the nation would face immediate, engineered instability. Lives would be lost, and the fragile structure of independence they had worked so hard to build could fracture in a matter of hours. The advisors, acting out of a desperate need to preserve the state, laid out the four traditional paths of political survival. The first option was to quietly comply, issuing a carefully worded public statement that satisfied the foreign powers while attempting to save face domestically. The second option was to launch a preemptive strike, moving aggressively to arrest suspected conspirators and risk a bloody, unpredictable civil war. The third option was to open a back channel for negotiation, begging the foreign masters for a compromise that would inevitably erode their sovereignty piece by piece. The fourth option was to remain completely neutral, offering no clear response and hoping to simply delay the inevitable. Each of these four paths had its own cold, strategic logic. Each offered a slight chance of immediate survival. But as the discussions circled the room, the profound emptiness of these options became glaringly apparent. None of them addressed the true nature of the threat. They were all responses to a political crisis, but what the nation was facing was a crisis of the soul. If a leader chooses to compromise the fundamental right to self-determination just to avoid a conflict, what is left to govern? If you negotiate away the light of independence, how can you ever ask the people with calloused hands to trust you as they walk the difficult road ahead? Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The room fell into a heavy silence as the reality of the four options hung in the air. Every single path presented by the advisors required trading away a piece of the nation's dignity in exchange for a temporary illusion of peace. They were paths born out of a desperate desire to protect the visible structures of the government while entirely ignoring the unseen spirit of the people. To choose any of those four paths would be to admit that the empire was right, that an African nation cannot truly stand on its own, and that its freedom is only granted by permission. After listening to the deeply reasoned arguments of his inner circle, the leader finally spoke. His voice did not carry the panic of a trapped man, nor the loud, performative anger of a politician playing to a crowd. It carried the quiet, unshakable weight of absolute clarity. He looked at his advisors and systematically rejected all four options. The shock in the room was palpable. If compliance, attack, negotiation, and delay were all off the table, what else could possibly remain? With the 48-hour clock relentlessly counting down to a guaranteed military coup, Ibrahim Traoré decided to take a fifth, unwritten path. He systematically rejected all four of the standard, calculated paths to survival, not acting out of blind defiance or a sudden rush of emotion. He rejected them because every single one of those options was built on a fatal compromise. He understood in that quiet room that the ultimatum was not merely a test of strategy, it was a test of what cannot be easily measured or replaced. If he chose to bow, even slightly, to preserve a temporary, illusionary peace, he would be planting a toxic seed in the minds of his people. He would be teaching them that sovereignty is something that can be bent under pressure, that dignity is negotiable, and that the future belongs only to those who hold the leverage of global finance. He realized that before he could decide what to do with the nation, he had to decide exactly what kind of leader he was. Was he a man who merely protected his position and managed foreign interests, or was he a guardian of the soil who stood for something that could not be bought or threatened? Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member, not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for Sankara's Echo's mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The true genius of the foreign threat was its profound psychological target. They did not just want to remove a president, they wanted to erase an idea. A man can be removed from office, a political system can be dismantled, and a government can fall and rise again. But if the core conviction of a nation is shaken at its roots, if the people are forced to watch their leader publicly renounce his own principles, out of fear the damage spreads quietly and widely. It tells the men and women with calloused hands, the ones who pour their sweat into the earth, that their harvest will never truly belong to them. It extinguishes the light on the road to true independence, replacing it with the cold, familiar shadows of subjugation. The empire wanted him to stand before the continent and prove that resistance was futile. That was their real objective, the absolute control of a message. In the long, solitary hours of the night that followed the meeting, the true weight of leadership settled upon him. The most difficult battles a leader will ever face do not feature tanks rolling through the streets or the deafening sound of gunfire. They take place in absolute silence, in a room where no advisor, no general, and no ally can step in to help you. It is a battle between two internal voices. One is the loud, convincing voice of fear, speaking of severe consequences, of economic loss, of a devastating military coup, and of the heavy risks to personal safety. But the other voice is conviction, and conviction does not shout, it does not rush, it simply remains. It quietly reminds a man of what cannot be taken from him unless he voluntarily gives it away. It became crystal clear that the power the foreign architects appeared to hold was not entirely complete. They could threaten his position, they could engineer devastating instability, they could trigger their sleeper cells and command their forces to march. But they could not reach into the inner space of his conviction and force him to surrender his belief in the sovereignty of his nation. They could only take the nation's dignity if he handed it to them on a public stage. A country's wealth can be stolen, its security can be compromised, and its infrastructure can be damaged, but its soul can only be surrendered. Once he fully embraced that absolute truth, the overwhelming pressure of the ultimatum began to lose its paralyzing grip. By the time the final hours of the 48-hour countdown began to close in, the internal storm had completely passed. Nothing in the external world had changed or improved. The threat of the coup remained exactly as it was. The foreign forces had not withdrawn, and the internal risks had not magically disappeared. But within the leader, something had become permanently settled. There is a profound kind of peace that does not come from safety, but from absolute certainty. The decision was no longer heavy, it was clear. He would not give away what they could not physically take. The date was set, the exact time was fixed. A massive national broadcast had been arranged for the evening prime hour, the precise moment when the largest possible number of people would be watching, not only in the capital, but across the vast expanse of the African continent. This timing was not accidental. The foreign powers had demanded a massive public stage for his surrender, and he was going to give them that exact stage. The atmosphere in the broadcasting center was incredibly tense. Security forces were at their highest alert, communications were locked down, and every movement in the capital was closely monitored. The shadow of the promised coup loomed large over the building. Yet, as he walked toward the cameras, his steps were remarkably steady. He was not rushing towards a conflict, nor was he hesitating in the face of ruin. He was simply moving forward, driven by the understanding that once a man knows exactly what he will never betray, the path in front of him becomes perfectly straight. The final hour of the 48-hour countdown did not arrive with the sound of sirens, but with a heavy, electric silence that gripped every household from the bustling streets of Ouagadougou to the most remote villages in the Sahel. The stage had been set by the foreign architects of the coup. They had demanded a global audience for what they believed would be a public ritual of surrender. They wanted to witness the moment the light of independence was extinguished, proving to the world that no African nation could truly defy their shadow. As the red light of the cameras flickered to life, Ibrahim Traoré did not look like a man under the crushing weight of a death sentence. He did not use the complicated, evasive language of a politician trying to negotiate a middle ground. He stood before the microphones not as a man seeking protection, but as a witness to a truth that no amount of foreign gold or military hardware could ever alter. He looked directly into the lens, knowing that the men who had orchestrated the threat were watching from their distant, climate-controlled offices, and that the soldiers of the planned coup were waiting for the signal to strike. I speak to you tonight. His voice resonated with a quiet, unshakable gravity, not to discuss the terms of our survival, but to define the nature of our existence. We have been told that our sovereignty is a liability. We have been commanded to trade our dignity for a false stability, and to renounce the very path we have chosen for our children. He paused, the silence in the room so profound it seemed to echo across the continent. I will not do it. I will never deny the right of this nation to own its future. My commitment to the absolute independence of our people cannot be bought, it cannot be threatened, and it will not be destroyed. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this. Sankara's echo sends you not just thanks, but a blessing for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. The declaration was simple, direct, and stripped of all decoration. It was not a performance of power, but a manifestation of conviction. By refusing to follow the script written for him in foreign capitals, he had effectively drawn a line in the sand, not in the politics of the day, but in the principle of the ages. He made it clear that while an empire can seize a building or disrupt a market, it has no authority over the inner life of a person or the collective spirit of a nation. The freedom of the human soul is not an object to be transferred or negotiated. It is a fortress that only the individual can choose to surrender. The reaction inside the broadcasting center was immediate. The air seemed to shift as the reality of his words settled. There was no applause, no cheering, only the kind of absolute stillness that follows a definitive truth. The cameras remained rolling, but for a moment, the entire system seemed to freeze. The foreign handlers, the internal conspirators, and the waiting mercenaries were all faced with a variable they had not included in their cold, strategic calculations. A leader who was entirely willing to lose everything visible to protect what was unseen. He had turned the very stage they provided into a weapon of liberation. By speaking his truth openly before more than 1 billion souls, he had transformed a private threat into a public testament. If the coup proceeded now, it would not be seen as a correction of policy, but as a brutal assassination of a people's will. He had stripped the empire of its mask of stability and revealed its raw, predatory nature. The countdown had ended, and the certainty of the coup now hung in a strange, unexpected limbo. When he finally stepped away from the microphones, he did not feel the rush of relief that comes when a danger has passed, because the danger had not passed. The forces of betrayal were still armed. The foreign units were still positioned. The sentence was still waiting to be carried out. But as he walked back into the shadows of the hallway, he carried a quiet strength that no army could replicate. He was no longer a man carrying a question. He was a man who had given his final answer. He had held the line. The 48-hour deadline passed not with the sound of a shattering explosion, but with a profound and heavy silence that echoed across the globe. The certainty of the military coup, which had been presented as an unavoidable sentence, simply did not occur. As the sun rose over the capital on the following morning, the expected chaos had been replaced by a quiet, disciplined resilience. What the foreign architects and their internal conspirators had fundamentally failed to calculate was that the power of a single, unyielding truth is often more disruptive than the most meticulously planned military operation. Behind the scenes, the gears of the machine had begun to seize. Reports emerged that the identified factions within the security system, who had been waiting for the signal to strike, found themselves paralyzed by the weight of the public declaration. They had expected to move against a leader who was isolated and compromised, but they found themselves facing a nation that had been revitalized by the absolute clarity of his conviction. Vigilance and responsibility had replaced panic. Many of the key individuals involved in the planned betrayal were located and removed quietly, without the need for public display or unnecessary noise. This is the hidden victory of sovereignty. When a leader refuses to give away what cannot be physically taken, the very foundation of foreign pressure begins to crumble. The empire depends on the cooperation of the victim. It requires the leader to internalize the fear and translate it into compliance. But once that fear is rejected on a public stage, the leverage of the bully disappears. The people with calloused hands, who had spent their lives working the soil, understood that their harvest was finally protected by a line that would not be moved. The response from the surrounding region was a testament to the shifting tides of history. From the borders of Mali to the vast plains of Niger, voices of solidarity began to rise. These were nations that understood the crushing weight of foreign ultimatums, and they recognized in this moment a shared victory. They saw that a different outcome was indeed possible, that standing firm does not always lead to collapse, but can lead to a new kind of regional stability built on mutual respect rather than coercion. Across digital networks and community gatherings, millions of individuals began to ask themselves the same question that had been placed before the world: what do I hold that is not for sale? What you have witnessed today is not a conclusion, but an opening. Africa's story of pride and independence is still being written, and each voice that joins makes the chorus stronger. Subscribe now, not as a favor, but as a commitment to follow this journey. Because the next video will not just continue the story, it may reshape how you see the world. Do not let this moment pass into silence. Subscribe and stand ready for the chapter that comes after this one. We have seen that leadership is not first about the power a man controls, but about the principles he refuses to surrender. It is about knowing that some losses are temporary, while the loss of one's soul is permanent. The road to true independence is long and often lit only by the flame of one's own conviction, but it is the only road that leads to a real future. The world may watch for a time, but what remains is the example of a choice made in the stillness of the night and held in the piercing light of day. This is the truth that cannot be forced, cannot be bought, and can never be broken. The era of manufactured dependency is reaching its inevitable end, giving way to a new dawn where the soil and the soul are finally reunited. In this monumental shift, the unwavering vision and leadership of Ibrahim Traoré serve as a powerful reminder that an African nation can indeed forge its own path without external permission. The success of Burkina Faso in reclaiming its territory and its dignity has provided a blueprint for the entire continent to follow. As the old empires scramble to maintain their grip, they find that they can no longer suppress the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré, which has ignited a flame of independence that will burn until every strategic resource is back in the hands of its rightful owners.